April 12, 1945. The Kremlin. Moscow. Late evening. Joseph Stalin is leaning over a table covered in military maps, his finger tracing the red lines marking Soviet positions east of Berlin. Across from him sits General Alexei Antonov, Deputy Chief of the Soviet General Staff. 2 glasses of tea sit cooling on the table. The room is thick with cigarette smoke and the tension of a war nearing its end. Outside these walls, the Red Army is preparing for the final assault on Hitler's capital, the prize the Soviet Union has bled for nearly 4 years to reach. Then the door opens. An aide enters quickly. Too quickly for routine. He's carrying a single sheet of paper, a decoded intelligence report from NKVD reconnaissance units operating in Germany. Stalin's expression doesn't change, but his finger stops moving on the map. The aide speaks quietly. Stalin takes the paper. He reads it once, then again. He sets it down and taps a location on the map. Erfurt, Chemnitz, Central Germany, 200 miles from Berlin. American positions. General George Patton's Third Army, and they're still advancing. Northeast. If this is your first time here at WWII Elite, hit that subscribe button right now. We uncover the untold stories of World War II that changed history. Stories you won't find in textbooks. And if you're already part of the WW2 Elite community, drop a comment below and let me know, should Patton have been allowed to take Berlin? Let's get into it. Stalin looks up at Antonov. His voice is calm, almost flat. Where is Zhukov? Antonov straightens in his chair. Marshal Zhukov is at his forward command post on the Oder River, Comrade Stalin. The Berlin offensive is on schedule. April 16th, 4 days from now. Stalin's hand moves across the map to the Soviet lines. Zhukov's first Belarusian front, Konev's first Ukrainian front, both positioned along the Oder-Neisse line roughly 30 to 5 miles east of Berlin. For weeks they've been regrouping, bringing up ammunition, preparing artillery. The largest offensive in military history is about to begin. But now Stalin's finger moves west, past Berlin, past the agreed demarcation lines, to the American positions. And where is Patton? Antonov hesitates. According to this report, Comrade Stalin, approximately 320 kilometers from Berlin. That's 200 miles, Stalin says. He doesn't look up from the map. 200 kilometers closer than he should be. The math is simple, brutal. The Americans crossed the Rhine River on March 22nd. That was 3 weeks ago. In that time, Patton's Third Army has advanced over 250 miles through Germany, an average of 12 miles per day. But Soviet intelligence indicates that in the last week alone, American armored columns have been moving 30 to 40 miles per day. They're not slowing down. They're accelerating. Stalin lights his pipe. The flame illuminates his face for a moment. That's impossible. General Eisenhower gave his word. They would halt at the Elbe River. That was the agreement. Antonov chooses his words carefully. Apparently, Comrade Stalin, General Patton may have received different orders. Or perhaps he trails off. Stalin finishes the thought. Or perhaps Patton simply decided the race wasn't over yet. Let me give you the numbers that were terrifying Stalin at this exact moment. By April 12, 1945, the military situation in Germany looked like this. Soviet forces, exhausted, bloodied, but determined, were holding positions 35 miles east of Berlin after the brutal Vistula-Oder offensive. That campaign had cost them over 270,000 casualties. Now they were preparing for the final push. The offensive was scheduled for April 16th. Soviet planners estimated 5 to 7 days of intense urban combat to capture Berlin once the offensive began. That meant the hammer and sickle would fly over the Reichstag sometime around April 23rd, maybe April 25th. But Patton's Third Army was already at Erfurt and Chemnitz, 200 miles from Berlin. Some reconnaissance elements were even closer, near Leipzig, only 150 miles out. And here's what made Stalin's staff panic. If American armor continued at their current pace, 35 miles per day, they could reach Berlin's outskirts in 5 to 6 days. That's April 17th or 18th, before the Soviet offensive even properly began. The Americans were closer to Hitler's capital than the Red Army that had fought all the way from Stalingrad. Stalin looks at the map for a long moment. Then he speaks, his voice very quiet. Get me Zhukov immediately. Within the hour, an encrypted communication goes out from Moscow to Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forward headquarters on the Oder River. The message is brief, the tone is urgent. The Allies are attempting to reach Berlin before us. Whoever reaches Berlin first will take it. Accelerate all preparations. The offensive timeline is now critical, but Stalin isn't only communicating with his own commanders. He's also sending urgent diplomatic cables through the Soviet ambassador in Washington, through military liaison channels to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The message to the Western Allies is carefully worded but pointed. Reports indicate American forces advancing toward Berlin beyond operational boundaries discussed at Yalta Conference. This creates risk of conflict between Allied forces in close proximity. Request immediate clarification of General Eisenhower's operational intentions. The response from Eisenhower comes back within 24 hours. It's professional, reassuring, and if you're Stalin, deeply suspicious. Eisenhower's cable states, Berlin has lost its former strategic importance. My forces will halt at the Elbe River as previously agreed. Current Third Army operations are directed at eliminating remaining German resistance in southern sectors and investigating potential Nazi Alpine redoubt fortifications. Stalin reads this message aloud to Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Then he sets it down. Eisenhower says Berlin has no strategic importance, yet his general is 200 miles away and showing no signs of stopping. Tell me, Molotov, which one speaks the truth? The Supreme Commander or the general with the tanks? It's a fair. Patton's reputation precedes him. Stalin knows exactly who he's. This is the American general who raced across France faster than the German army had in 1940. The general who relieved Bastogne in the middle of winter. The general who crossed the Rhine before anyone thought possible and then kept going. Patton doesn't ask permission. He acts, then asks forgiveness. And right now, he's 125 miles closer to Berlin than Stalin's best marshals. So Stalin makes a decision. If Eisenhower won't stop Patton, or can't stop him, then the Red Army needs to move faster. He calls Zhukov again. This conversation, according to Zhukov's post-war memoirs, is brief and intense. Comrade Stalin, we will take Berlin within 10 days of beginning the offensive. You have 7 days, Zhukov. Not 10, 7. Because Patton is already moving. Stalin hangs up. Then he issues new orders. The Berlin offensive will begin on April 16th as planned. But additional reserves, 77,000 troops, will be committed immediately. Artillery preparation will be intensified. And the operational order is now explicit. Take Berlin at any cost. Any casualties? Any methods? There is no second place in this race. And then Stalin makes one more call to NKVD intelligence operations in Germany. I want to know every kilometer, every hour. I want to know before Patton's own commanders know. But here's what Stalin didn't know at that exact moment. While he was accelerating the Soviet timetable and committing additional divisions to the Berlin assault, Patton was on the telephone with Omar Bradley, his immediate superior and commander of the 12th Army Group. And Patton was furious. According to Bradley's memoir, A General's Life, the conversation went something like this. Brad, we're 75 miles from Berlin. 75. My lead elements are at the Mulde River. We've got intact bridges. The Germans in front of us are surrendering in battalion strength. There's nothing between us and Berlin except defeated enemy units trying to run east, straight into the Russians. Bradley's response was firm. George, you have your orders. Halt at the Elbe. Eisenhower's directive is clear. To do what? Sit and watch while the Russians take the whole city? We can be there in 3 days. The directive stands. Berlin is in the Soviet occupation zone per the Yalta Agreement. It's a political decision. There's a pause. Then Patton says something that Bradley records in his notes, though it wasn't included in official reports. We're going to regret this. Mark my words, Brad. We're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Why not now, while our army is intact and we can still do something about it? Bradley doesn't respond to that. He repeats the order. Halt at the Elbe. The conversation ends. But Patton's forward reconnaissance units don't stop immediately. They're already probing beyond the Mulde River. Some are within 125 miles of Berlin, and this is exactly what Soviet intelligence is reporting to Stalin every few hours. Scout patrols, tank destroyers, all moving northeast, all still advancing. April 13th, April 14th. The reports keep coming. Stalin is reading them personally now. American reconnaissance active near Leipzig. Forward elements possibly within 120 kilometers of Berlin as of 14 o'clock hours. Each report adds to his sense of urgency. and his suspicion that perhaps Eisenhower's reassurances aren't worth the paper they're written on. And then something else happens that makes the situation even more tense. Winston Churchill weighs in. Churchill has been watching this race with growing alarm. He understands something that perhaps Eisenhower, focused on military objectives, doesn't fully appreciate. Berlin isn't just a city, it's a symbol. Whoever takes Berlin defines the victory. Whoever's flag flies over the Reichstag writes the narrative of how this war ended. And Churchill knows that narrative will matter in the peace to come. On April 15th, Churchill sends a cable to Eisenhower. The language is careful, but the meaning is clear. If we deliberately leave Berlin to the Russians, even if it costs us dearly, may we not pay dearly for it in the future? Stalin is shown this message within hours. Soviet intelligence penetration of British communications is extensive, far more than the Western Allies realize. Stalin reads Churchill's cable, and his response to his Politburo colleagues reveals his thinking. He sees what Berlin represents. He knows what it means for the post-war order. So why doesn't Roosevelt? But Roosevelt isn't making these decisions anymore. Because on this very day, April 12, 1945, the same day Stalin learned that Patton was 200 miles from Berlin, something else happened that changed everything. President Franklin Roosevelt died. Suddenly. A cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia. Vice President Harry Truman, a former haberdasher and senator, is now President of the United States. He's been in office as Vice President for less than 90 days. He's never been fully briefed on the Yalta agreements. He doesn't know about the Manhattan Project. He doesn't know the details of post-war occupation zones. And he's relying entirely on his military commanders, particularly Eisenhower, to make strategic decisions about the endgame in Europe. Eisenhower's decision holds. Third Army will halt at the Elbe River, not 1 mile beyond. But what Stalin doesn't know yet, what he won't learn for another 36 hours, is that the halt order is finally being enforced. Patton's units are stopping, reluctantly, angrily, but they're stopping. April 15, 1945, 1 day before the scheduled Soviet assault on Berlin. Stalin receives intelligence reports that suddenly change tone. Third Army units establishing defensive positions along Elbe River. No forward movement observed in past 48 hours. Another report, this one from GRU military intelligence. American commanders appear to have received direct halt orders. Intercepted communications suggest General Patton protested orders to Supreme Commander. Stalin reads these reports with his senior staff present. General Antonov is there. So is Marshal Konev, briefly back from the front for final coordination. Stalin looks up from the papers. Why would they stop now? They're 125 miles from Berlin. We're still 35 miles away, preparing to fight for every street. This makes no sense. Antonov offers an explanation. Perhaps, Comrade Stalin, General Eisenhower has finally imposed discipline on his subordinate. Or perhaps this is operational deception. Make us believe they've stopped while they prepare a sudden thrust. Stalin considers this. He makes his decision. Either Eisenhower has finally controlled his general, or this is deception. Every hour. And ensure our offensive proceeds exactly as planned. We take no chances. April 16th, 1945, 3 a.m. Berlin time. The Soviet Berlin offensive. 9,000 artillery pieces and mortars open fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. It's the largest artillery bombardment in human history. The sound can be heard 100 miles away. Searchlights illuminate the smoke and chaos, turning night into artificial day and blinding the German defenders. Zhukov's first Belarusian front attacks directly toward Berlin from the east. Konev's first Ukrainian front strikes from the southeast. The target: Silo Heights, the last major defensive line before Berlin. The fighting is catastrophic. German resistance, though weakening, is fierce and desperate. They know what Soviet occupation means. They fight for every bunker, every trench, every house. In the first 48 hours, Soviet forces suffer over 30,000 because Stalin's order is absolute. Take Berlin at any cost. And while this massive offensive is underway, while Soviet soldiers are fighting and dying by the thousands, Stalin is still receiving reports about American positions. And those reports now consistently say the same thing. Americans have stopped. Third Army is holding defensive positions along the Elbe River. No forward movement. No probing attacks. They're digging in. Stalin allows himself, perhaps for the first time in days, to believe it. Eisenhower wasn't lying. The Americans have stopped. Berlin will belong to the Red Army. But he still doesn't fully understand why. Why would they come so close and then stop? Why race 200 miles through Germany and then halt 125 miles short at the ultimate prize? It doesn't make tactical sense. Unless Churchill was right. Unless this is about politics, not military strategy. Unless Eisenhower is choosing to honor agreements made at conference tables rather than seize opportunities on battlefields. April 25th, 1945. Something happens that neither Stalin nor Patton could have fully predicted. Not at Berlin. At Torgau, a small town on the Elbe River, the meeting isn't hostile, it's celebratory. American soldiers from the 69th Infantry Division and Soviet soldiers from the 58th Guards Rifle Division embrace on the broken bridge spanning the river. Vodka is shared. Photographs are taken. Both armies have been fighting toward each other for years. The Soviets from the east, the Americans from the west. And now they've met in the heart of defeated Germany. But the meeting happens exactly where Eisenhower said it would, at the Elbe, not at Berlin. Patton's army has stopped 125 miles short of the city that would have defined victory. 5 days later, on April 30th, Soviet soldiers raised the hammer and sickle flag over the Reichstag building in the center of Berlin. The photograph of that moment, a Soviet soldier holding the red flag atop the shattered dome, becomes one of the most iconic images of World War II. Berlin has fallen to the Red Army, exactly as Stalin needed it to happen. The cost was staggering. The Berlin operation, from April 16th to May 2nd, cost the Soviet Union approximately 80 to 1,000 dead and 280,000 wounded. 23 days of brutal urban combat. Every street contested, every building a fortress. But Stalin had his victory. The Soviet flag over Berlin, the symbol was secured. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army, which had advanced from the Rhine to the Elbe over 250 miles in 3 weeks, suffered approximately 2,000 killed and 8,000 wounded during that same period. The casualties were drastically lower because German forces in the American sector were collapsing. Entire divisions were surrendering rather than face Soviet capture. Wehrmacht commanders were deliberately retreating westward, trying to reach American lines, because they knew what awaited them in the east. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, especially not on Patton, who watched from the Elbe as smoke rose over Berlin 125 miles away. When asked later why he ordered the halt at the Elbe, why he deliberately left Berlin to the Soviets, Eisenhower's answer was clear and consistent. He wrote in his memoir, Crusade in Europe, "I regarded Berlin as nothing but a geographical location. I was interested in destroying the German army, not in capturing territory for political purposes. It was a military decision based on military logic. Berlin was already agreed upon as part of the Soviet occupation zone per the Yalta Conference. Taking it would cost American lives. It would risk potential conflict with Soviet forces in the chaos of Germany's collapse. It would violate agreements made between Allied leaders. And strategically, with Germany's army shattered and Hitler's regime in its final days, the city itself had no military value. But Patton saw it differently. According to his diary entries and conversations recorded by his staff, he viewed the halt at the Elbe as a catastrophic mistake. His alleged private comment, never officially documented but widely reported by those who served with him, captures his thinking. We're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Why not now while our army is intact and we can kick the Red Army back to Moscow? We could do it. We have the fuel. We have the ammunition. We have the best damned army in the world, and now we're just going to stop and hand them half of Europe? These two perspectives, Eisenhower's political pragmatism and Patton's military opportunism, defined the tension that would shape the next 45 years of history. May 1945. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. Victory parades are being planned in Moscow, in London, in New York. But in a private meeting in Moscow, Stalin is reviewing maps with his senior commanders. Marshal Zhukov is there. So is Marshal Konev. They're discussing the Berlin operation, analyzing what went right and what could have been improved. But Stalin's mind is on something else. Something that almost... He looks at the map, at the American positions from April, at the distance between Patton's forward elements and Berlin. 125 days at the pace they were moving. Stalin speaks quietly, almost to himself. Then he looks at Zhukov. Marshal Zhukov, tell me honestly, if General Eisenhower had not stopped Patton at the Elbe, if the Americans had continued their advance, could we have reached Berlin first? It's the kind of question that could be dangerous to answer incorrectly. But Zhukov has earned the right to speak frankly. He considers his response carefully. Comrade Stalin, we would have reached Berlin. Our forces were our resolve was absolute. But he pauses. The race would have been close, very close. How close? Zhukov looks at the map. Perhaps days, Comrade Stalin. Their armor was faster. They had fuel. They had momentum. Our soldiers were exhausted but determined. If Patton had not been ordered to stop, if he had continued at the pace intelligence reported, another pause, military history might have been written differently. Stalin lights his pipe. The silence in the room is heavy. Then he says something that multiple sources, including Zhukov's memoirs and accounts from Molotov, record independently. It's the quote that defines this entire moment. The assessment that reveals how close the Cold War came to starting hot in the spring of 1945. Then we are fortunate that Eisenhower is their commander, and not Patton. One understands politics. The other understands only victory. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't Stalin complimenting Eisenhower. This wasn't Stalin insulting Patton. This was Stalin's cold, calculated assessment of the closest moment when the Western Allies could have dramatically altered the post-war map of Europe, and he knew it. Stalin understood exactly what had happened. Eisenhower had made a political military decision based on agreements, on maintaining Allied unity, on minimizing casualties for a city that would end up in the Soviet occupation zone anyway. From Eisenhower's perspective, the military value of Berlin didn't justify American lives or the risk of friction with the Soviets. But Patton saw it through a different lens entirely. To Patton, Berlin wasn't just a city. It was a symbol of victory. It was strategic positioning for the confrontation he believed was inevitable with the Soviet Union. It was leverage. It was the opening move of the next war, a war Patton was absolutely certain was coming. And Stalin knew both of these things. He separated the political calculation, Eisenhower, from the military aggression, Patton, and he understood which one was more dangerous to Soviet post-war ambitions. Eisenhower could be negotiated with. Eisenhower respected agreements. Eisenhower thought in terms of alliances and conferences and occupation zones. But Patton thought in terms of tanks and objectives and seizing ground. If Patton had been supreme commander, Stalin knew the race would have continued, and the outcome might have been very different. Stalin's quote reveals relief. Genuine relief, because he knew how close it came. 200 miles, 125 miles, 5 days of advance at current pace. Stalin knew that if the American army had reached Berlin first, if they'd planted their flag on the Reichstag before Soviet soldiers could get there, the entire narrative of the war's end would have changed. The political landscape of post-war Europe would have been different. The balance of power at the negotiating table would have shifted. But it didn't happen. Eisenhower's halt order stood. Patton stopped at the Elbe, and the Soviet flag flew over Berlin. History has debated this decision endlessly. Churchill called it a fateful day. Patton, until his death in December 1945, called it the biggest mistake of the war. Eisenhower defended it for the rest of his life, insisting it was the right military and political choice. Who was correct? Perhaps both. Eisenhower was right for April 1945, right for ending the war with minimal additional casualties, right for maintaining Allied unity long enough to finish the job, right for honoring the agreements that had been made. But Patton was right for 1946, for 1947, for the next 45 years of Cold War that followed. He understood that the alliance of necessity between the United States and the Soviet Union would fracture the moment Hitler was defeated. He saw that the post-war struggle would be about positions and leverage, and who controlled what territory. And from that perspective, giving the Soviets Berlin, giving them all of Eastern Europe, giving them the symbolic victory without contest, that would have consequences. Those consequences played out over decades. The Iron Curtain, the Berlin Blockade, the Berlin War, Eastern Europe under Soviet domination until 1989. The Cold War that Patton predicted began almost immediately after World War II ended. And it started, in many ways, with the decisions made in April 1945 about who would take Berlin. Years later, when Eisenhower was asked if he regretted the decision not to take Berlin, his answer remained consistent. I wouldn't have sacrificed a single American life for a purely political purpose. For Eisenhower, the choice was clear. Lives mattered more than symbols. Military objectives mattered more than the destruction of the German army was the goal, not the capture of any particular city. But Soviet Marshal Konev, who commanded forces in the southern thrust toward Berlin, later admitted something remarkable. In interviews after the Cold War ended and Soviet archives began opening, Konev said, "If Patton had not been stopped, if American forces had reached Berlin first, Stalin had given us orders that we were to take the city no matter the cost, no matter what that cost included. The collision between our armies, in the chaos of Berlin, with both sides rushing for the same objective, it would have been catastrophic." Perhaps Patton understood that. Perhaps that's exactly what he wanted. Think about that for a moment. A Soviet marshal, decades later, confirming that if American and Soviet forces had both been racing for Berlin simultaneously, Stalin's orders were to take the city no matter the cost. That includes potential engagement with American units. That includes the risk of Allied forces firing on each other. That includes the possibility of the war ending not with handshakes at Torgau, but with American and Soviet tanks facing each other in the streets of Berlin. Patton may have understood that risk. He may have been willing to accept it, because in his view the confrontation was coming anyway. Better to face it in April 1945 with the full might of the American army in Europe than to face it years later after demobilization, after the Soviets had consolidated control over Eastern Europe, after the lines had been drawn and hardened. We'll never know if Patton was right, because Eisenhower's decision meant that scenario never played out. The war ended with Allied unity officially intact. Berlin fell to the Soviets, and the confrontation Patton predicted happened, but it happened as a Cold War, not a hot one. But here's the historical footnote that makes this entire story even more significant. Remember the date? April 12, 1945. The day Stalin learned that Patton was 200 miles from Berlin. The day Stalin panicked and accelerated the Soviet offensive. That same day, Franklin Roosevelt died. Harry Truman became president. Truman, who had never been briefed in detail on the Yalta agreements. Truman, who didn't know about the Manhattan Project. Truman, who was relying entirely on his military commanders, especially Eisenhower, to make strategic decisions in Europe. Some historians have wondered, what if Roosevelt had lived another month? What if an experienced president, one who had negotiated personally with Stalin at Yalta, one who understood the political implications of every military move, had still been in office during those critical final weeks? Would Roosevelt have confirmed Eisenhower's halt order? Or would he have seen what Churchill saw, that Berlin mattered beyond its military value? We'll never know, but Stalin knew how close it came. 200 miles. That's the distance between Patton's forward positions and Berlin when Stalin received that intelligence report on April 12. 200 miles. 5 days at American mechanized pace. 5 days before the Soviet offensive even properly began. 200 miles. That's how close the Cold War came to starting hot in the spring of 1945. That's how close the map of post-war Europe came to being drawn by tank battalions instead of conference tables. That's how close we came to a very different ending to World War II. Stalin's quote, "We are fortunate that Eisenhower is their commander and not Patton." One understands politics. The other understands only victory, captures the razor's edge that history balanced on in April 1945. It wasn't a compliment or an insult. It was an acknowledgement, an admission, and maybe, just maybe, a warning about what might have been. That's the untold story of what Stalin said when Patton reached 200 miles from Berlin first. It's the story of a race that almost happened, a confrontation that was narrowly avoided, and a decision that shaped the world for the next half-century. If this story showed you something about World War II you've never heard before, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to WWII Elite. We bring you the hidden moments, the untold decisions, and the words that changed history. Drop a comment and tell me, was Eisenhower right to stop at the Elbe, or should Patton have been unleashed towards Berlin? I read every comment, and I want to know what you think. Thanks for watching WWII Elite. I'll see you in the next one.